Good morning and welcome to the second day's first plenary session. I'm delighted to see that after 10 hours of having you enclosed in this room, all of you decided to come back today. That's great. So you will get 10 more hours of punishment and we're ready to go on. You know the story, tight schedule. We need people to keep up with the time frame. And most importantly, we need people, when they ask questions, to ask questions and not go on long statements, please. So I would like to introduce today's first main speaker, Professor Paul Gregg.
Right, okay. So that's going to be a pretty hard act to follow. What I'm going to say is distinctly lowbrow compared to that, relatively mundane. I'm going to talk a bit about the school-to-work transition, what we know about policy intervention that can make a difference to the extent to which unemployment is focused on young people and young people struggle to make that transition from education into sustained employment. It is in Richard Freeman's kind of space. I think I am talking about bandages here rather than transformational stuff to do with the Greek economy. Though I hope the bandage has a little ointment attached to it so it can actually potentially do some healing. The key point is that this is not the first mass youth unemployment crisis we've had. We've been here before. This is my third exposure to mass youth unemployment. The first was at the sharp end when I was long-term unemployed myself. And my response to it was to go to university because the prospects I saw in front of me were so bleak. The second was working in the mid-90s with the prototype Labour government of the period about what they called the New Deal programme. And most recently I'm talking with the Irish government about what they can do towards introducing the European job guarantee. My point about that really is we have been here before, we've tried a bunch of stuff before, we can draw some lessons out of what we've tried before to inform us a little bit about what can work and what can make a difference. And I think that although there is a long history of what I'll call of indifferent policy making in this space and some notable failures, there is enough evidence of what works that we can start to draw some useful policy lessons. And so I'm going to try and end with a relatively modest proposal which the foundation may like to try and take forward as part of their kind of program. Okay. All right. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm not really going to give you a quick overview of European unemployment because I think you've had about 6 already. So I'm going to skip that apart from making 1 or 2 points. I'm going to talk about a relatively simple framework to talk about the issues to do with school-to-work transition. I'm going to talk about what evidence we have that makes a difference within that space, and then end on this kind of idea of what might be a central proposal. Okay, so the one point I want to make about the state of European unemployment is that what we've had for young people is a catastrophic fall in employment. That catastrophic fall in employment is focused on the younger age groups, even amongst the young. Okay, so you get the biggest tilt down in employment amongst the younger kind of age groups. What is happening, in a sense, is a void is opening up between completing education and entering sustained employment. A gap is emerging. If you like, that's what happens when youth unemployment comes. Not everybody is hit by that kind of exposure. Some of them make successful transitions, but more people have extended gaps. And in the Greek case, that extended gap is going well beyond 25 and close up to sort of 30 kind of territory. Okay? So the first, I'm not going to do all these graphs because you've seen them already. So the bulk of youth unemployment comes in a sustained period between leaving full-time education and entering employment. Once you enter employment on a sustained basis, you typically stick. There are minorities who get a year's work or more and then it breaks down, but by and large, the bulk is this hole that occurs between leaving education and entering employment. Yeah. The second point I wanted to make about the kind of the employment side of the issue is that the collapse in employment is not just post-education. The youth labour experience whilst mixing work and education together has also been dramatically hit. so that the part-time work, the evenings and weekends kind of employment associated with continued study is disappearing, which means that the bulk of unemployed, particularly the long-term unemployed who are entering into their mid-20s, 22, 23, have had no work experience whatsoever. Yeah, in the UK's exposure to it, half of our unemployed young people have never done a day's work, right? And that is the kind of what I want to hold in your head, because it's a central message to what I want to say, is that that is a fundamental part of the problem, is the lack of past work experience and history to making those kind of successful transitions, okay? Right, so if you're thinking about it in that kind of space, that we've got this gap, this void, opening up between leaving education and entering sustained employment, you're instantly in a framework of saying there are three major areas of potential intervention. The first is you can extend educational participation. You can try and get the kids to stay in longer. Okay, I'm going to talk about these in more detail. The second is you can try and accelerate the job entry. You can work at trying to move people quicker into the employment space, or you can try and fill the hole with something useful. Yeah, that you take the gap and try and do something in that gap, which is investing in the kids in terms of their future opportunities. Okay, and I'm going to talk about those three, because that is essentially what policy making in this space has done, is one of those three areas has been attempted to varying degrees and is being attempted now. The space in part of this is around this. The EU is currently proposing a youth guarantee, a job guarantee in this space. I'm not going to talk about that because one of the panelists, Pierre, is going to talk about that in much more detail from the Commission, but it's very firmly within this kind of space. Right. Okay, so extending education. This is young people's first response to the disappearance of work. Around half of the collapse in employment for young people is absorbed by them extending educational participation in terms of time. Yeah? Governments are supporting this kind of process, and it's why the unemployment figures look much worse than the NEET figures, is as the jobs have disappeared, young people have extended education as their first response. Governments have supported that response. It is one of the automatic stabilizers within the system, which is that governments generally support people extending education when work disappears and when they're young. We don't do that for the adults so much, but when young people, work disappears, we extend educational participation, okay? What that means, in a sense, is we've done it already. It may not be the high focus of any kind of policy intervention because it's already built in. In a sense, we are probably in the space of diminishing returns to extending education, because the first waves of it have already happened on an automatic basis, so it probably isn't the first place we should be thinking about now, because it's already kind of built in terms of mass educational participation, that we're likely to be diminishing returns. And the second point is, as far as we can see, is that it doesn't do the next bit. It doesn't accelerate the job entry. Yeah? That extending education on its own, particularly general education in school, does not accelerate job entry. I'll come to apprenticeships, which is rather different, but that, in a sense, is kind of the state of where we are. At the margin, this doesn't accelerate the job entry kind of phase. However, there is some value in extending education for some marginal groups who are potentially at risk of leaving education very early with low levels of educational participation. This is almost a conversation to the Americans in the audience, is around high school dropouts. Yeah, we know high school dropouts are very disadvantaged in their later lives. There is policy intervention in this space going on, which is making a serious difference to reducing the levels of equivalent high school dropouts in European situation, particularly at the moment in the UK, where they are extending school. They are raising the participation age. The raising of the participation age is an attempt to use essentially legal constructs to say to kids, stay in education longer, and they are. Okay, so that if you look at the lower line here, this is the NEET rate of 16 and 17-year-olds. It is going down through the economic crisis. It's not because there's jobs. The jobs have vanished. What it is the kids are staying on in school. Yeah, and there is a value in that extending education, that using legal constructs And the other kind of feature that's been very successful is what I'll call intensive careers advice with kids who are at high risk of dropout. So taking the kids who are in the most disadvantaged families, who are perhaps in social care, those that are already truanting, those are showing signs of educational disengagement. There are a number of programs which have been successful increasingly in the UK and Ireland to work with those kids, to hold them in the education system longer, and with some substantial effects to their educational outcomes. So this is not the big space, but at the margins, it's a useful space to say that there are some groups at risk of extreme educational disadvantage where educational participation extension is useful. The other point I wanted to say about this is just at the time when the 16 and 17-year-olds educational participation is going up, so their NEET rate is going down. As soon as they're hitting 18, it's going up. Yeah? So there is no transition directly into employment from extending education. There is this gap that occurs between it, between the extending education and the entry into employment, and that just as, if you like, the extending education is increasing at the bottom, 16 and 17-year-olds, the NEET rate for the older group is rising simultaneously. Yeah. Okay, makes the kind of point. Okay, so the second area is hiring support. There's two sort of broad models here, which I'll try and elucidate. The first is recruitment subsidies or tax breaks of some form to take on young workers. It's been used extensively. It comes in two variants. One is highly targeted, which is that you focus on long-term disadvantaged individuals and offer tax breaks to take on those specific highly disconnected individuals. The other are broad tax cuts associated with reducing employers' social insurance contributions towards young workers. The second one has a problem, which is that it comes with extensive deadweight loss because you're giving it to everybody, to every employer of every young person. Yeah, so you've got a lot of deadweight cost. The former has the problem that the high level of targeting generally creates some bureaucracy attached to it, which tends to discourage firms from engaging with it. And in the recent UK experience with this is they offered a €2,500 subsidy to take on young, long unemployed people and got almost nobody willing to take it on. We tend to think about offering free money to employers. They would queue up to the door. Yeah, you can't give this away. Yeah. So the kind of message is it's not, in a sense, terribly successful in volume terms. At the margins, it may be value, but it's not the kind of place you're going to get big volumes of employment gains. Generalized cuts in social insurance contributions for young workers are probably best targeted at the very young, where the employment rates are so low that the deadweight costs are relatively small. You're not giving it because the employment rate is so low in that kind of space, you're not actually losing very much by cutting away in those kind of things. The Swedes have tried this. They felt extremely disappointed with the success of cutting employers' social insurance contributions of young workers. They thought it was going to be an important contributor to tackling youth unemployment. It has been very, very disappointing. The UK government is just about to try it. Right, okay, so the second sort of broad brand of hiring support, which is definitely successful, it definitely helps, it's relatively low cost, but is not, again, going to be high volume, is supporting people's active job search, that requiring, monitoring, supporting effective job search is a valuable addition to the armory of helping young people transition into employment. Young people, in a sense, a lot of young people don't have an experience of trying to market themselves to an outside agency such as an employer. They're used to everybody trying to get their engagement. In school, the teachers are trying to sell education to the kid. The kid isn't had to sell itself to anybody in the. They struggle, particularly those with relatively low self-esteem, relatively introverted, struggle with the concept that they have to go out there and market themselves on an employer's market. And that is something where we have evidence that you can support and you can make a difference. It helps. It's not going to revolutionize youth employment, but it's part of the pathway to tackling it. This is being used in many, many countries now. The Irish government is just setting up its program, having not really had it. Okay, it's buying in expertise from the UK and the US in order to try and deliver it, but it is part of the armoury. Okay, right. So what about the middle? This is the kind of the final part, is what can we do that's productive in the space which is emerging between leaving education and entering sustained employment. We can talk about it as productive in more than one sense. We can talk about it in terms of, does it raise job entry? It's productive in the sense it's accelerating kids moving into employment afterwards. We can talk about it as productive as giving people skills which may be valuable in the longer term. And we can talk about it as productive in some kind of social production sense, that they're doing things which actually matter, value now, the kind of social enterprises, the kinds of community participation in a sense which may be making a contribution whilst they're engaged. Right, so we can talk about it in many senses. I've roughly, I think, ordered those in the importance. I would stress the raising of the job entry as the ultimate kind of productive element of any program you want to run. The other stuff is nice, it's additional, but that's the kind of the primary focus. Okay, we've done lots of these things around the world. We're pretty close to having some blueprints that work, and I'm going to show you a couple. Okay, but I just want to give you some general statements about these kind of things. If you're talking about young people on benefits and you offer them a job placement, which they have to take, and that job placement is really ugly, it's no-waged, it's boring, it's picking up litter, yeah? The first response is they do work a bit harder at getting other jobs to avoid it, yeah? However, those ugly jobs, if you like, work fair, is that for those who actually do go into it, it actually offers nothing else. Yeah. So there's a bit of there's a push kind of element to avoid it, but what it offers in terms of what it's valued to the young person to moving into sustained employment once they're participating in it is essentially zero. Yeah. So it has a displacement effect, but no investment, no positive kind of returns apart from that. Okay. The second lesson out of these things is if you put people in a placement, an internship, a traineeship, is they tend to drop their job search for the next job because they're already doing something. Yeah? So they stop or reduce the efforts to look for the next job, right? This is called lock-in. So the kind of first lesson, in a sense, is there is a danger of losing some of the motivation and focus on the future employment opportunities whilst you put somebody on some kind of placement. We can do something about that, but that is one of the risks. The third kind of point, and which we've learned in a sense, is that if you offer high quality experiences, the placements are enriching in a broad sense of what that might mean. That is what produces positive employment effects at the end of the placement in terms of people moving on into positive employment outcomes afterwards. And lastly, and it's sort of coming back on an earlier point, is that trying to avoid those kind of damaging lock-in effects is maintaining a focus on searching for the job that's coming after the placement whilst you're on the placement. Is that you work with the young person whilst they're doing the work placement, the work experience, the internship, to focus on what's coming next and how to apply to and sell themselves to employers afterwards, right? Okay, so I'll give you an example. Sorry, one point is that we've done a lot of these things. They don't always work. Some of the effects are even negative, but there are models which have proven success, and I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them. Okay. Okay, so the first one is the Future Jobs Fund. It's a model where providers are offered free labor. So they get a kid for 6 months for free. The wage is met by the state in this particular case. Yeah, so that's the attraction to the employer. But what the employer has to bid with, it's not bidding with the currency of money, it's bidding with the quality of the experience it's giving the kid. They have to make a proposal and saying this is what the young person will receive whilst they're on that internship with us for 6 months. And it's the quality of that experience which is being offered, which is the currency which says which ones are supported and which ones aren't. Okay, the point, in a sense, is if the placement person comes up and says, this person is going to be stacking shelves, it goes to the bottom of the pile. If it is, and these were some of the most successful in the creative media, arts and culture sector, kind of cool jobs, yeah, that's what we want. We want several of those, yes, please. Okay, so the quality of the experience is the currency, yeah. Most of these placements were in charitable, social sector, community, cultural organizations, theaters, symphony orchestras, etc., etc. There was lots of media-based stuff within it. It had evidence of success, which is shown in the picture at the bottom, which I can hope you make sense of, is that this is showing the employment rate of the participants compared to kids who are a slightly bit older who are ineligible, right? So it only goes up to 24. So the 25-year-olds can't be in it. They're the red line. Okay, so the red line is the employment rate of the 25-year-olds who weren't in the system. The green line is of the participants who are under 25 who are in the program. The point is they've been matched on past history of employment and worklessness, region, gender, that kind of stuff. So they look identical backwards. So if you start on the right-hand side, there is no difference in employment rates before the program starts. They go into the program, yes, that boosts employment because they're in the program. But the key point is the gap that emerges between the 25-year-olds and the 24-year-olds after the program finishes. Yeah? The employment rate amongst the participants is of the order of 10% higher. And that gap is sustained for 18 months. That's when they stop the evaluation. It's not when the gap necessarily ended. The total cost of the program was about 7,000 quid, so that's what, 8,000 euros. Half of that was recouped during the period of this 18 months where higher employment rates were there. This is mainly in lower benefits because they're no longer on unemployment-related benefits. It is reasonable to assume that if those gains were sustained for another couple of years beyond the evaluation period, that it would be cost neutral to the exchequer, that the returns in the form of lower benefits and higher taxes are broadly equal to the cost of running the placement. Okay? This is useful territory. Okay? The Irish have a version of this. It's called Job Bridge. There are differences. The evaluation is not as robust, but this is Ireland in a situation which is not Greece, but it's not so far away in terms of the experience of youth unemployment and the collapse of youth employment. Okay? They've got a program which is an internship program. It runs typically for 9 months. Less use of charitable sector, more use of private companies. The post-employment rate of participants in the program is 50%. I can't say how much additional that is because they didn't have that kind of evaluation, but 50% employment rate for long-term unemployed people 6 months after a program has been participation in the internship as code looks pretty decent. Yeah, if we can get 50% of Greeks who do young people, long-term unemployed, do an internship and get 50% into employment afterwards, I think we'd be pretty positive. Yeah. Okay, so I've put up some evaluatory kind of evidence. Right, I'm not going to talk about that because that's coming next. So I'm going to just finally end on a proposal to the foundation. What I would like to say is I would like the foundation to run an internship program. That is, I don't mean they take on interns themselves, though that might be a bit of it. Is that through their extensive networks, through other foundations, through its charitable relationships with other organizations, both in the private and the charitable sector, it uses those kind of connections to ask those organizations to offer high-quality experienced internships to Greek young people. The internship would be part-time. I emphasize that in part because you want to make sure that they are still looking for work whilst they're on the internship kind of program. I would say it's waged, but it's going to be low waged. The part-time means it also is relatively low cost. I would ask the foundation to meet the costs of those wages to the individual kids who are participating. The organizations who are delivering it get free labor. The kid gets the experiences and a wage. Society gets the potential value that those kids are contributing in terms of social value whilst they're engaged in the employment. But centrally and crucially is that alongside that, the internship should be, well, I'd say again, the internship should be bid on the value of the experience. It's the quality of the experience that should be the currency of whether you fund one of the internship places or not. And it needs to come with a package of supports, says, that works with the individual kid to look at the next job opportunity, to how to market themselves, how to promote themselves to future employers, and if possible, to get the organizations themselves to be engaged in that forward-looking process. They're using their networks, their potential to try and secure future employment opportunities for those young people. It's not going to be 100,000 Chinese arriving in Greece, spending large amounts of money, transforming the Greek economy. It can make a significant difference to the individual experiences of young people facing youth unemployment. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. If the purpose of the second day is actually to come up with solid proposals for the foundation to consider, I think we started the right way. We have a very diverse group of panelists. These are people who have been addressing the very issues that Paul brought up to see in his lecture from many different angles. And we're going to go from right to left and start with Pierre. 10 minutes, please. Let's try to stick to the time frame. I suspect that there will be a number of questions since the talk touches directly upon what we're trying to discuss here, so let's keep it on time, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. Yes, Pierre Mairesse, I work in the European Commission of the European Union. I am more on the side of education, so more on the side of the supply of skills. Just one comment on the debate yesterday, so thank you very much for the invitation, and I think yesterday it was also interesting. This idea that we cannot solve the problem of youth unemployment only by education. It's also through macroeconomic policy and labor market policy. But on the other side, we are convinced that for all our member states in the European Union to have highly and perhaps rightly skilled people is certainly an asset for the future, maybe for the long term. I will come back on the short term, but maybe for the long term, to define the growth of the future, to define the jobs of the future, and to define the labor market of the future. I say that because sometimes in this period of crisis, and the big challenge is to find a way to answer to short term, and we have to do that, to answer to some mismatches, even if yesterday I understood that in Greece it's perhaps not the major problem, but I think it's still a problem. So we have sometimes the impression that education should answer to short-term labor market problems. Yes, but we have also to prepare really a long-term growth and jobs. I come now to the short-term initiatives and possibilities inspired by the presentation of Paul. And the first one is, he mentioned that already, the so-called youth guarantee. What it is? It is a commitment from each member state of the European Union to give the opportunity to somebody leaving the education system in 4 months to get either a job or a training, or to come back in education sometimes for some people, or to get an apprenticeship or a traineeship or an entrepreneurial opportunity. It's easier to say, not easy to implement. The tools we have to implement that are political, because the 28 member states of the European Union committed to prepare an action plan in each country by the summertime now to implement the youth guarantee. Because it's necessary to find funds. It's necessary to rethink some infrastructure. For example, the question of guidance of young people, you mentioned that. It's very important in this period to have a strong guidance. It's necessary perhaps to rethink some vocational providing systems. So it's not an easy task for the member states. So the first tool is a political tool. The second tool is funding. The European Union decided to dedicate 6 billion of euros, 10 billion of dollars in 2 years for this operation. It's a lot, but it's not enough. So it's still a leverage investment, but it's important. For Greece, it will be around 170 million of euros in 2 years. But as I said, it's certainly not the panacea, and it is necessary to find national funding, and it's not easy in Greece, that's completely clear, but also private, and perhaps also foundation funding. That's the first initiative we proposed to put in place. I would like also to mention another one, which is the so-called work-based learning for vocational training. It was mentioned yesterday, I think, by the Minister of Tourism and Culture. It's still a pilot project in Greece. It's sometimes inspired by Germany or Austria or Denmark, and it is called the dual system. What it is, a dual system in Germany, in Austria, or in Denmark? It's not apprenticeship. It's not, I am at school, in vocational schools, and at a time I will go in enterprise, which is already very good, for a number of months, and after that, normally I will try to get a job. That's more the apprenticeship formula, which is good. We want also to support that, and we have launched a kind of alliance for apprenticeship to have pledges of enterprises, because one difficulty in a number of countries is really to find proposal by enterprises for an apprenticeship. But I come back to the dual system. The dual system is totally different. It's this idea that every week you will spend some time in an enterprise, and you will spend some time in the vocational institute. So it means a real strong commitment of enterprises to be not only there for giving opportunities for young people, but also to be in a kind of teaching, to be associated in the curricula. So curricula are not decided only by the education world, they are decided both by the education world and by enterprises. So a key role of social partners. You know perhaps that in Germany, for example, there is a long tradition of work with social partners for vocational training, and the youth unemployment in Germany is very low. So I'm pleased that Greece started to implement such a kind of solution, but you remember perhaps yesterday it was mentioned it's for tourism for the time being in Crete.
Tourism, agriculture, entrepreneurship.
Okay, thank you for the correction. In Crete, and for still a limited number of young people because it's a pilot. So one key challenge for the future will be to scaling up the system for a large number of vocational training area in Greece. A third initiative in Greece, quite interesting, is called the zones of educational priority. It's linked to dropout. It's linked to young people from family with a socioeconomic background which is quite low, and some very often with a migrant background. And this idea to have a kind of a proactive for some zone, because normally it's in some geographical area, to have really an all-day training, to have really a support of families, support of parents, to work with the civil society, not only with schools. It's an interesting idea, I would like to mention that, but it's still, again, in the very pilot phase. So it's still, again, about 5 local communities. Because behind this support to young people really at risk of difficulty, at risk of marginalization, it's really also a question of investment. So just to mention 3 possible areas where cooperation could be very useful between public authorities, either European or national, and private enterprises and private foundations. That's certainly really important. Still one more comment, which will be my conclusion. What works, what fails. It's never black and white. But it seems to me that there are a lot of new initiatives from the foundation, we heard yesterday about entrepreneurship. Maybe one idea would be to avoid a dispersed approach. With European Commission with nice initiatives, and the Greek government with nice initiatives, and the foundations and so on. So to see how we can work really together. I mentioned already the question of funding. If we have the youth guarantee, which is approved by the Greek government, how the private sector and the foundation could help, not necessarily to reinvent other schemes. To take another example with the youth guarantee linked to entrepreneurship. If we, in the guidance of the young people just after education, we identify that it could be interested in some entrepreneurial activities, we have seen yesterday that there is the Young Entrepreneurial Association in Greece, or even social entrepreneurship. So just to guide young people towards the tools which are already there. So to avoid dispersion, to work together in terms of financing, in terms of cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I think you're absolutely right. And if we have seen something here in the US is that although funding is an issue, even if you do have a lot of funding, does not solve everything. And I think Detroit has been a great example where a lot of people have thrown a lot of money there to try to solve a very dire situation. And there are a lot of questions to what extent any of these programs have succeeded. So collaboration between the private, the public, and the philanthropic sector is essential, especially in Greece. Nicholas?
Thank you. I might actually stand up because I get very passionate about this subject, and for the safety of the panellists on either side, I think that might be a good
you can
move.
dance too. So
thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I've really enjoyed yesterday. It was a very good background for me, and to really understand all sorts of issues. And it's actually a tough audience when you're standing up here to speak to. There's a lot of experts in the room and a lot of people I know, and so I won't look at them in case I say something that is diametrically opposed. But I thought we'd start by a very quick show of hands, if that's all right. I did leave my translator at home, so if I do start speaking Australian strine, please, during question time, say what was that? I'll speak slowly. But show of hands, I wanted to ask you, when thinking about your son or your daughter or your grandchild or a young person that you know, would you be open to the idea of a pathway that is not a university pathway? So could I have a quick show of hands? If you're in the room, Okay, I'm in that category. I've got a 10-year-old daughter, and she told me that she wants to be a chef, which would be a vocational pathway, and a vet, and which would be a college or university pathway. And I hope that if she does do that, she doesn't do it in the same building. But anyway, there we have it. So in the US, the National Association of Manufacturers survey to gauge public opinion each year. They do a lot of surveying, so people in the US would know this. 90% of respondents ranked manufacturing at the top of the list of important industries. So that says a lot, doesn't it? 80% thought building a strong manufacturing base to be a top priority. And when asked at the end of the survey, the last question says, would they encourage their own children to join the manufacturing industry? And what do you think the answer was? It was actually a resounding no. So I think one of the things that we are facing is there is often, and it's around the world, and I've travelled extensively, you do see this myopic focus about university or college for everyone. And I wanted to say to people associated with universities, by no means am I anti-university, anti-education in any way, shape or form. I happen to start my life as an apprentice chef, and very much like the German, or actually the German or Swiss system, I actually, moved across throughout my career. I ended up at a university in Boston. And for me, it was very much about the right education at the right time. So with that, I thought I'd actually start in reverse. I just wanted to start with a few pitfalls that I've seen over the last couple of days, things that have just sprung to mind, because I certainly don't want to end on that. Paul, we were talking about people staying in extended education. And I think that one of the challenges, particularly in the US, if you look at that, is this education, what does it cost? And if it is chalking that up to a loan, you only need to do a quick little Google search, or whichever search engine you happen to like. I'm not affiliated with Google. You will see that in the US, the student loan debt has passed $1 trillion. The average student loan is $30,000. Now, people are staying in the education system so they don't have to pay that loan back. So there's a lot of challenges with that. And let me tell you, Australia is far from perfect. And I know this is being recorded, so hopefully my government won't get to see me saying this, but they're on the verge of what I'd describe as a fairly disastrous policy decision, which is they're actually going to start charging for apprenticeship and vocational training, and it could be $8,000-$10,000, but $8,000 or $10,000 to undertake any vocational program when you're a young person and you don't have access to money is a scary thing. But the government said, don't worry, we'll follow the US system and we'll work out a loan arrangement. So I'd be strongly recommending against that. Giving away money, we were talking about giving away money, never works. Incentives, employer incentives are just straight out cash handouts, never work, because employers, if they do join the program, Paul, if they do join the program, as soon as the money stops, the job stops and it all falls apart. So any skills program that I have seen as successful must be built around the skills need, a genuine skills need. Other quick pitfalls, avoid chopping and changing. I think when a direction's set, you need to follow that path, and you see a lot in the not-for-profit sector, companies that chase funding all over the table, and it never works well, because as soon as that funding stops, you find yourself, out on the side of the playing field. You're better off setting a clear direction and moving forward. And that then leads to, which may be controversial, because I heard it a lot yesterday, avoid pilot programs. Now, at lunch I'm happy to explain why, because it's quite complicated. I've talked to a lot of people about it. I'm a believer in you either do it or you don't do it. If you're going to do it, Bob, you're shaking your head, so that's good news. So I've got one person in the room who possibly agrees with me there. If you're going to scale it up, either do it or don't do it. There's a lot of risks associated with running a pilot program. All you need is one little hiccup and a very good program could fall apart. And of course, you've got to be aware of the disconnect between education and the labour market. But so very quickly, I'm just going to go over 3 areas where I see there could be impact: environment, partnerships, and play. Now, it's not playing, I was just seeing who was looking at me. It's not play, it's actually playing to your strengths. And so if we're talking about environment, create an environment that employers would want to invest. Now, this is going to be a huge challenge, from what I've seen. If you look where employers are investing in the US, a lot of organisations, a lot of companies, and I'm not going to get into any political reasons why, but if you want to ask me at lunch, a lot of businesses, big businesses, are moving down to the southern states, and there's varying reasons for that. But the employment conditions and the states are actually making all sorts of incentives available, some around tax, and it doesn't have to be tax incentives, but it's creating an environment where employers want to employ people for the right reasons. Raising the status of skills is going to be very important in, when we're talking about the environment, and really looking at this idea of supply and demand. Training for training's sake never works. You can't have a young person, and you see it in Australia with Indigenous Australians. I meet so many young Indigenous Australians who've got a wall full of certificates, but they don't have a job. They've just got program after program after program, but it doesn't end in a job. Partnerships, I'm seeing a lot of traction. If I'd have to say, from my travels around the world, the US, it's community, business, educators, government. Government should not be bearing this alone, and economic developers working together and forming partnerships. And that can flow through into all sorts of interesting programs. We've heard about apprenticeships, and I think that's a whole nother subject, and we could spend a day talking about that. But apprenticeships need to be refocused. There's what I describe as modern apprenticeships. I think people have got some connotations about, terminology, what an apprenticeship may be, what an internship may be. So I think you really need to be clear. In the UK, I think now we were hearing yesterday about a massive spike in apprenticeships, particularly amongst women. But there are reasons for that, and I think there are some terminology issues around that. But maybe Paul might have some further thoughts on that. But one thing I did want to talk about under partnerships is a unique partnership that actually started not far from here in Brooklyn called PTEC. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of it or aware of it, but this is an article which was it was actually the cover of Time magazine about 4 weeks ago, and this pretty much says it all. The school that will get you a job. So this is a new education model that I'd strongly recommend people have a look at, and here it is, very short here, how it works. Students remain in high school an extra 2 years and earn an associate's degree. Employers help craft the curriculum so graduates are ready for good jobs. And the payoff is that a promise of a job on graduation. So employers have got a skin in the game, so I'd strongly recommend, I'm happy to email it around if people wanted to see links, but Google Obama, PTEC, it'll come up and you'll see you've got the President of the United States on the bandwagon talking about this new innovation. There's 26 schools now in the New York state area, and they're all over the country. I'm getting to the end. Finally, play to your strengths. I must say I was a little bit nervous about focusing on one particular, maybe not one industry, but particularly one market. I would definitely not be putting all my eggs in one basket. From a person who spent a lot of time in tourism, I was involved in hotels in Australia, where Australia pretty much built the north strategy of our country was built on the Japanese tourism boom, and we've got hotels fitted out from Sydney, right up through Queensland, and the Japanese market fell apart overnight. So I think it's important to have some sort of diversity there. Not everything needs to be new. Not everything needs to be new. There's some great innovations, and I'm sure there are great innovations going on the ground, and I think maybe for the foundation it's not creating all the time new things, it's looking for things that may naturally be existing, and they need some assistance to spur them on and provide resources and assistance like that. Professor Freeman, so I didn't agree with him about the particular focus on China, but I would say I did agree with him about the idea of using small and agile to advantage. And a country to look at would be Singapore, 700 square miles. Singapore really has reinvented itself in Basically, it's got a fantastic skills and vocational program, but what are they doing with it? Well, one of the things they're doing with it is they're actually exporting their education. They create systems and then they sell it to their neighbouring countries. So Singapore is quite happy to sell vocational know-how into Malaysia and countries within the region. But they've also built a very strong petrochemical base. They've got a very strong tourism base where they've marketed themselves no longer as a fly-in for one night. You actually go and spend 3 or 4 days there. And so leading on to that, and in summary, I think that to me some advantages, and coming from Melbourne, and I'm sure people who aren't aware, there's a very strong connection between my home city and Athens. Maybe look towards Melbourne. If we could get everyone to come from Melbourne to come on an international trip once a year. Natural beauty, cultural heritage, and a strong identity. And to me, they're 3 things that really stand out, and they're 3 real strengths. So the question is how to maximise those strengths and how to create advantage over those around you. So thank you again, and I've really enjoyed being here, so thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nicholas. Jonathan?
Thanks very much. Let me address straight on the proposal that Paul put on the table, because I think it does have the advantage of being a sort of very practical example of a model which already to some extent exists and has been tested in practice. And while I disagree quite strongly with the previous speaker about the idea that we should not pilot programs. In general, I think it's crazy not to pilot programs. We've wasted billions of dollars on social programs through not piloting and evaluating programs. But I think, given, as we've heard throughout this conference, the extent of the employment emergency that Greece and indeed a number of other Southern European countries face at the moment, we certainly do not have time to do a 2-year piloting and evaluation program of the sort of program that Paul was describing. We need to do something in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal and Italy. We need to do it now. And hence there is a strong premium on doing things that we know have already, at least in part and at least in some areas, already been tried and worked, and that is one of the merits of Paul's proposal. But I thought it was interesting to contrast the proposal we heard from Rania and Panelists yesterday for a New Deal in the 1930s US style, with the proposal we just heard from Paul. Now, of course, they're not entirely mutually exclusive, but they are quite different. And I think it's worth trying to tease out what the relative merits and demerits are when looking at what the foundation might be able to do. In particular, first I should declare an interest. I've known and worked with Paul on these sorts of programs for well over for the last decade and more. And I broadly agree with pretty much everything he said about what the evidence says about how these programs have worked in the UK and some other European countries. So I'm naturally prejudiced to agree with him. But I think we should start by putting the contrary case, and the case that was at least implicitly made by Rania and a number of others actually yesterday in the Greek context, which is that the programs that Paul was describing, that evidence comes in the context of a relatively flexible labour market, a relatively healthy private sector, and a long established set of small and medium enterprises that are used to hiring young people, possibly not 16 and 17-year-olds, but at least 18-year-olds and over. And while the UK has certainly had its economic problems over the last 5 or 6 years, we are not in the sort of, we do not have a fixed exchange rate. We have an independent central bank, thanks to the efforts of my colleague Adam in the front row, among others. monetary and fiscal policy in the UK, well, not far from optimal, was nothing like the disaster that it has been in Greece, thanks to the not so productive efforts of the European Commission, not your directorate, but your colleagues in ECOFIN and of course others in the ECB and indeed in Frankfurt. So this is a very different environment, and economic theory regrettably suggests that programs which are broadly supply-side oriented of the sort that Paul has described are likely to be less successful in an environment with A, a less flexible labour market, and B, where there is a serious problem of demand deficiency. So that does swing you back towards thinking that there are some attractions to programs that actually take a rather more statist top-down approach, which simply says we just need to pay people to do jobs. It doesn't matter very much what, as long as they are occupied doing something, they're being paid, they're off the streets, they're doing something that at least has some marginal social product. That's preferable, and that's basically what we heard from Rainy yesterday. Now, I think the counter-argument to that, which somebody put in a question yesterday before I had time to put it, which is, well, the problem there is one of state capacity in Greece. It is not clear at all that the state has the capacity to provide that volume of pure public sector jobs. The example of India was mentioned, but my understanding is that the Indian Public Works Programme has also suffered from lack of state capacity, and moreover, going on to the second reason why you might be cautious about these programs, which is, well, Rani described it as an explicitly temporary program, because you don't want to, over the long term, necessarily expand the volume of state sector employment in Greece. You may not want to shrink it either. You may want to make it more productive, but you don't want to do that simply by hiring people through a make work program. I find it very difficult to see how the political economy of that works in Greece, frankly, of making this sort of program explicitly temporary. And again, pointing to India, the political economy hasn't worked particularly well there. So I think there are potential issues with both types of programs. So where does that leave me? I think it comes back to something which at least a couple of speakers said yesterday, which is something I learned from this conference, which is the very different, not just the fact that the Greek economy has certain rigidities and supply-side deficiencies, which of course we all do know, but that the structure of employment in Greece is very different from that of most other European countries. In particular, that it suffers, while state employment is not in numbers particularly different, it suffers from a severe deficient. It has lots and lots of self-employment and what you might call somebody yesterday described as nano enterprises, or essentially family businesses, but relatively few small and medium enterprises, that is, businesses which are not solely family-based but employ anywhere between 5 and 250 people. And that clearly, making that shift to that sort of employment is a necessary condition for a sustained recovery in employment, a sustained recovery in youth employment in Greece. So I think that what that means is that we need, I come back to the starting point that the sort of program Paul has suggested is broadly the right way to go, but it needs to be able to feed through and transition into sustained employment in those sorts of small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, obviously, that requires a bunch of structural reforms which go well beyond labour markets. But I do think that there is potentially the potential to join up the sort of program Paul described with the supply of credit to small and medium enterprises, because it's quite clear, again, as a number of people said yesterday, that Greece is in the grip of a very serious credit crunch. while that is, while many of us would like to see more flexibility on fiscal policy, that's unlikely to be forthcoming in the near future. But flexibility on monetary and credit policy is something which it's rather easier to do, both on a Greece and a European level. So the idea of combining the sort of program that Paul described with credit easing, credit guarantees, credit support to small and medium enterprises, and I don't just mean the sort that are described in here, the entrepreneurship entity, which we're going to talk about next. That's great. The idea of startups, entrepreneurial startups. That's very important for the long-term future of the Greek economy. But actually, a lot of the employment creation that I'm talking about will come in fairly mundane SMEs, to be absolutely honest. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And the idea, I think, of having something that doesn't try just to build entrepreneurial startups, but also just says to good but not earth-shattering small and medium enterprises, yes, we will provide you with credit, yes, we will give some form of credit guarantees, we will work with the public institutions to provide and package up those credit guarantees and try and join that up with a sort of employment support that Paul is talking about. Seems to me to be something which I would hope could work with the grain of the Greek economy and the Greek labour market over the medium term. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie, please.
Thank you. It's been fascinating for me to be at this conference as well. I don't get to a lot of more academic focused conferences, and so I've learned a lot, but I also want to be one of the voices to bring this down to concrete, practical ideas that we've seen work in a very similar context to Greece. And I guess I also want to instill a little hope into the conversation. I go to so many of these conferences on youth unemployment, and I worry that people go away with the basic idea that this is so complicated, so dependent on the big macroeconomic reforms that government and other actors have to take such a large role in making progress on, that there's nothing really we can do right now to make a difference. And I guess I'm going to argue for there are a few things that we know work in our experience that make a difference for young people. I also want to bring this down to the young person. I mean, that's the other thing that's often tough in these conferences is you don't hear the voice of young people themselves telling you what their challenges are, what their hopes and aspirations are, what their experience has been looking for a job and being rejected time and again, or not even having the first idea, as our speaker said, about even how to look for information about jobs. And I'll just say a quick anecdote of the kind of young person that we work with at Education for Employment. I think it's very similar to the Greek young men and women that the foundation hopes to support. The typical young person in the Middle East and North Africa where Education for Employment operates, we're in 6 countries from Yemen, Jordan, Egypt, Palestinian territories, Morocco, Tunisia, is somebody who has, with their family, made a bet that education is the answer. They've gone through university, public university. A lot of these systems have invested in public university systems that are heavily subsidized. You can come from a poor, low-income background and go all the way through university. They get a degree. They think this is their chance for a future. It's been typically focused on the civil sector, civil service, I should say, or a hope to be employed, and then they sit there for months, years. And that's really the population we're dealing with. Young people who had that promise, the family had that promise that education would lead to employment, but in fact education leads to unemployment. Thus our name, Education for Employment. And our model is very simple. It's to start on the other side, start on the demand side, really understand at a sort of forensic level, company level, what are the skill needs that companies have and are projecting to have in their industry and in their company, and then design programs or bring in programs and curricula that are adapted to the needs of the private sector. Now, what do we ask the private sector? We're not asking them to pay a lot of money. We are asking them to support some of the cost of this. But more than anything, we're asking them to pre-commit to hiring our graduates, because there's so much education and training that essentially doesn't lead anywhere, and there's training fatigue. I'm sure there is in Greece, there is across the region, where young people leave school and they take a technology course, they take an English language course, but it's not connected to that job. It's not connected or the job search part of it is not there. So what have we learned that may be relevant for the foundation and for Greece? We haven't talked a lot about specifically the skills that young people and employers really need. It goes to the point our speaker made earlier, which is so many young people coming out of school have no experience in work. So the young person that we're working with has never had an internship, has never been on a job site. They need basic skills to understand how to show up on time, how to dress, how to be confident in their ability to speak to their employer, to work with colleagues, and they also need some confidence that they can be critical thinkers, to solve problems, to work on projects. They don't get this in school, and this is what we instill in our training. We combine practical simulated job experiences where we're mimicking the kinds of experiences they'll have on the job, and we're also placing them in short-term internships before they graduate so that they can have that experience and employers can also experience them before they go onto the job. And then, of course, you support them. You can't just place them and then hope that it's going to work out. You've got to support them. We provide mentoring supports, ongoing skill building. And so that full path of selecting young people in, training to meet the needs of the private sector, and then supporting them on the job is something we found to work. And look, we started 6, 7 years ago with a couple of companies in Gaza and Jordan, tough places, hired a few people. We're now putting over 3,000 young people to work in the private sector across 1,000 companies. It happened in 7, 8 years, and I know it can happen in Greece. What are the things that have helped make it happen? It goes to this idea of bringing the sectors together. In Morocco and Tunisia, we're working with the government, with private employers, and with external partners, Citi Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, funders who really believe in the promise of investing in work skills, placements, and supports on the job, and governments that provide access to universities so we can recruit young people through university systems, et cetera. The other thing we've learned is that you can't have a one-size-fits-all with young people. As our speaker said again, some of it is just lack of information. So we don't want to run people through our training programs for 8, 12, 14 weeks if really what they need is just access to the kinds of jobs that may be available, the kinds of opportunities. So there you need to connect them to job portals, and we're involved in some of that. And I think investing in basic job portals, in SMS technology that blasts out job announcements is one simple way you can get a lot of young people who just need that information to know how to look for a first job. A second category, young people who need a little bit more. We have a program called Finding a Job is a Job, because as our speaker mentioned, that is one of the things that young people coming out of school never get exposure to. Exactly how do you look for a job? How do you prepare for an interview? How do you put together a CV? It's a simple, low-cost way to help a large number of young people, in our case it's thousands, get some basic skilling and understanding of how to look for a job to get them on that path. And then obviously the more intensive supports that have been described in terms of apprenticeships, a mix of school and work for especially higher order skills is very important. But the last couple of things I'll mention that may be relevant for Greece is we haven't spoken a lot about access, and I wanted to ask a question following the lead of my colleague Nick. How many in this room had help getting their first job from somebody? I would venture the majority of us have. Most of the young people that we're working with, I imagine most of the people in Greece, one of the basic problems is they don't know how to access employers. They don't have a mentor or somebody they can turn to help them navigate the workplace. So there's, again, simple things that companies can do, and we're working with companies that are providing mentorship through their employees to just mentor a young person. It's something an individual can do. I was really inspired by a business leader I met last year who's gotten so sick of coming to these conferences and talking about the problem, said, you know what, I'm going to just do something myself. So he just did 3 things. He decided to mentor one young person to help him get a job. He provided one internship for another young person, and he helped place a third person. So there are simple things that people can take action to do. And I'll just close because I know we want to go to question and answers. That I think there's a really very powerful effect that this can have over time. It starts small, but it really can become almost like a movement. And what we're seeing is we've now put thousands of young people to work. They're referring us to their friends. They're becoming role models for their peers. Our Facebook page now is 75,000, 100,000 young people. There's a community of young people who've got to be role models that there's a different way. There's a more positive future for young people in places like Greece, Spain, Morocco, Egypt. And there's a really nice sort of spillover effect from seeing those role models. And I would encourage the foundation and others to think about this almost like a campaign to get young people to work, to get them into internships, into apprenticeships, and have them talking to each other, talking to employers, talking to educational institutions to really spur momentum over the next few years while we're working on the long-term challenges that so many people have mentioned in terms of the long-term growth, reinvesting, reimagining education, et cetera.
Thanks, Jamie. I have a feeling that we have a lively discussion ahead of us, so please be quick and please be precise. I just want to make one comment because I have a feeling that we may get sidetracked here. I think that the discussion about comparing Rania Andonopoulos' proposal yesterday and Paul's proposal today basically is a conversation about comparing completely different things, because we are dealing with two absolutely different proposals, apples and oranges. One tries to address a massive issue at an enormous scale, providing employment to millions, hundreds of thousands of people, and the other one basically deals with providing internships, apprenticeships, hope, and a number of different things at a much, much, much smaller scale. So I'm not thinking about whether these proposals are wrong or right. This is irrelevant, but I think we are comparing completely different things, and I would like to focus really on what this panel discussed. So please, the floor is open.
Thank you very much, but actually the comment I had in my head, or the question was, unfortunately, goes exactly the opposite of what you just warned us to do, so now I'm a little bit stymied. But I do want to thank all of the panelists. I think this was an excellent panel, and to my mind, I saw a certain integration into what we heard from Rania yesterday and what we heard today. And I thought what was useful about this panel is it integrated in a productive way, not as trade-offs, not as opposites, choosing one or the other, supply and demand side approaches for job creation and youth employment. And forgive me, but I do want to say that I thought we had some, actually, if we talk about designing a massive demand employer of last resort program, I thought there were many useful lessons in such a design coming from Paul's initial talk, the problem of locking in, the problem of capacity of the state, of the public sector, which most people are quite skeptical about in the context of Greece. But I think, nevertheless, the problem is people tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that, a massive job creation program just won't work in the context of Greece. It's not the... I think the question is how to design it properly. And there are examples, I don't want to take a lot of time, but there are examples of dealing with the problem of state capacity to run and design such a program, the problems of corruption that always people would raise, and so on. But I want to make that point. I think and also an idea just occurred to me that I haven't really reflected on a lot, but that there could be a type of dual track, using the German system, but a dual track employer of last resort program where there is serious effort to look at the aspirations of young people, not to put them in the type of meaningless jobs, to ensure that it's not a make-work program and that there's a way to combine the supply and demand side. Thank you.
Thank you. Please don't forget to state your name and your affiliation.
Yeah. Do you want to state your name? Steve Miller.
Thank you.
Could I just respond to that, just very quickly?
You can.
Just one little thing. Yeah, be very wary about airdropping in a vocational program like the dual track system from Germany. I think there's core elements, but there is cases around the world of where many countries have tried to do that, including the US, where German companies in the US have tried to bring in programs, and let me tell you, they give up fairly quickly, and then they start integrating with their communities and their community colleges.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank Paul. I'm very heartened by your presentation, in fact, because despite the a number of design differences that I could hear very clearly, anyway, nobody knows if it's going to be a full-time, part-time job or what shape, essentially a massive job as we propose it would take. This is for national deliberations, how it gets decided, not a proposal from the Live Institute. So, but what I want to note is the following. You are essentially proposing something that is taking place in Greece in a different form. All the social economy initiatives that are developing are closing in a gap that lack of government funding has created. And therefore, I see an immense opportunity in looking at the intersections between the non-profit sector. I'm happy. I'm going to stop because I see you going like this, and we can talk about it later.
Exactly
because
my thinking when I was
precisely,
thinking
yes, yes.
I didn't actually say it on the
Yeah.
slide. Is there's a lack of labour demand in Greece, but there's not a lack of need.
Exactly,
And there is potential
exactly,
to try
precisely.
And put young people
So
to work.
that is an idea for the foundation, which is to explore the spaces. One is the non-profit sector, another is the social economy initiatives, and so on and so forth, where we, instead of substituting and proposing diverse proposals, we can have the same aim, which is job creation, because we do not have enough demand for jobs, and then looking at the various scales and which social partners can enter at which scale. So it can have the kind of coherency that in fact Pierre suggested earlier, and that was a very welcome suggestion. One more comment, if you allow me. When we say that Greece does not have the capacity, it almost sounds like a technical problem that Greeks have. And we have people in the room that have worked within the apparatus of the state government as implementers and enforcers of policies. The capacity exists. The political, thank you for, again, I'm so happy I'm speaking and everybody, different people agree with what I'm saying. The political will is what has been missing in order to understand the constraints, the binding constraints, the clientelist methods that were in place, and those are being addressed and can be addressed. We can develop the capacity. When people say that, well, you know, in India, yes, they could do it. I did not want to bring up this example, but I have worked in Chiapas, and Chiapas does not have government because they don't allow government. And they were able to put a structure to implement and deliver the needed job creation. Final comment. The initiatives on the supply side are very welcomed. Learning how to present yourself to an employer is very useful. Please keep in mind these two figures. In Greece, in the last 3 years, we have had over 100,000 professionals that have left the country, could not find the country below the age of 29, not 24, but 29, could not find a job in the country. They did not change their skills in terms of how they present themselves and they write resumes, but they have found jobs abroad. So in Greece, at this point, I would encourage people that are thinking about employability to rethink it. This is not the main problem that we're facing, except for the age cohort that Paul spoke about, those exactly at the point of leaving secondary education and not finding the job. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone in the back, please? Andrea, down there, First Lady.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for giving me this opportunity to attend this really very interesting conference. My name is Theodoridou Naskia. I am General Director of Vocational Education and Training in the Greek Public Employment Service. And I would like to give you just some information about how the dual apprenticeship system is implementing in Greece, and also about these two pilot schools that we have already started to operate, as our minister
If you can be as quick as possible, because there are a lot of questions and we really are running late now. I would appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Greek Public Employment Service, OAEV, has big experience in implementing the dual apprenticeship system in Greece, as we have 51 apprenticeship schools all over Greece from 1952. During the last 1.5 years, we started a bigger engineering in our organization, and one of the main activities in this engineering concerns the improvement of this dual apprenticeship system. So in this framework, we have already started to apply in a pilot basis, and we started from the tourism sector with these two pilot schools. Because the idea is, first of all, to adapt the curricula to the needs, to the real needs of the labor market. Secondly, to have a real involvement of all the social partners in that. And, of course, to transfer the know-how from other European countries who have already applied in a very successful way this apprenticeship system. So in this case, we have as partners the German colleagues, also from the German Ministry of Education and the Greek-German Chamber, which of course helped us a lot in finding the enterprises which were very keen on being in this project and giving us their ideas about how to transform the curricula and all this. Also in this
If you can wrap it up, please, because there are people with a lot of questions, and this is not a question, please.
Yes, just I'm finishing. And just to say that we will have another pilot program we intend to have in the agricultural sector, so maybe we will have the opportunity to discuss about it.
One more question, please.
Thank you.
Professor Lerman. And then there is time during lunch for people to work together and ask each other questions. I'm sorry, it's very tight and we're running out of time.
Yeah, two quick points which sort of reiterate a little bit what I said yesterday about, first on the job creation. I do think the output issue is important, both from the point of view of public support, that they're not considered make-work jobs, but even more importantly, so that the supervisors are judged based on what actually happens, because that's what happens in a real workplace. And if you don't have that, kids tend to languish. I mean, we've seen this in our summer youth programs. Those programs that are fixated on what they're producing engage in a sort of discipline that is lacking when output issues are dismissed. Second, I do think that at the very young ages, some level of certification of these employability skills could be a part of such programs if you did it. My question is, though, you've had a jump of apprenticeships from 150,000 to 850,000 in the fairly short period in England. Many of them are not what I would call real apprenticeships, but a lot of them are. I'm surprised that you didn't say anything about that. And I realize that a lot of them are not the really youngest groups.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Should I respond?
Yes.
I mean,
we wrap it up. We finish with this, please.
Just a few sort of comments. I was planning to do something about apprenticeships in the talk, but it, you know, in the flow, I missed it. But the fundamental issue in the UK is the apprenticeship expansion has been amongst older people who are already in employment, and is a certification process of workplace skills they've already got. It hasn't been a significant expansion of sort of 18, 19-year-old, 20 type apprenticeships. They're not happy with that. They're working to change it, but in a sense, the first response has not been taking young people into a new apprenticeship. It's been certifying people who are already there. But I would, you know, it's been said, and I meant to say it, is there is a material difference between extending education and the dual model of class-based education combined with work experience, which an apprenticeship type offers, and it's a whole different and superior opportunity set. And I'm totally kind of with that. Comments, reactions to sort of other comments. I was given the mission, as I took it by Danny, who's not here, to at one level take a discussion around the sort of big picture policy kind of stuff and discuss what government programs have been looking like and that, but to come up with a proposal for the foundation, yeah, not a proposal for the European Commission Youth Guarantee. You know, that was what I took the mission to be. So I tried to take something which is an evidence base of what people have done in lots of different kind of settings and hone it down to something. I'm not deliberately saying do it small because that's the best. I'm just saying that's where we're talking about, you know.
Thank you, and thank you everyone on the table.